We managed to record this conversation with James Baldwin immediately after both of us attended that now famous meeting between a group of Mr. Baldwin's friends and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. I believe much of the emotion of that historic occasion spilled over into our conversation. In an attempt to ease the tension, I started by asking him to dig back and tell us something about his childhood and his growing up.
I was born in Harlem Hospital. We grew up on Park Avenue, uptown Park Avenue where the railroad tracks are. We used to play on the roof and in the, I can't call it an alley, but near the river. It was a kind of dump, garbage dump. So those are the first scenes I remember. I remember my father had trouble keeping us alive. There were 9 of us. I was the oldest, so I took care of the kids. I understand much better now. Part of his problem was he couldn't feed his kids. But I was a kid and I didn't know that. And he was very religious, very rigid. He kept us together, I must say. And when I look back on it, after it was nearly 40 years ago that I was born, I think back on my growing up and walk that same block today because it's still there. And think of the kids on that block now. I'm aware that something terrible has happened, which is very hard to describe. I am in all but no technical legal fact a Southerner. My father was born in the South. No, my mother was born in the South. And if they had waited 2 more seconds, I might have been born in the South. But that means that I was raised by a family whose roots were essentially rural and whose relationship to the church was very direct because it was the only means they had of expressing their pain and their despair. But 20 years later, the moral authority which was present in the Negro northern community when I was growing up, has vanished. People talk about progress, and I look at Harlem, which I really know. I know like I know my hand. And it is much worse there today than it was when I was growing up.
Would you say this is true of the schools, too?
It's much worse in the schools. I went to PS 24, PS 139, and I remember coming home from school, and my mother asked me, my teacher was colored or white, and I said she was a little bit colored, a little bit white, because she was about your color. And as a matter of fact, I was right. That's part of the dilemma of being an American Negro, that one is a little bit colored and a little bit white. And not only in physical terms, but in the head and in the heart. And there are days, this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. How precisely you're going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. And to be here means that you can't be anywhere else. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters. In a free country.
In a free country.
In the middle of the 20th century.
What do you think can be done to change the moral fiber of America?
I think the one has got to find some way of putting the present administration of this country on the spot. One has got to force somehow from Washington a moral commitment, not to the Negro people, but to the life of this country. It doesn't matter any longer, and I'm speaking for myself, for Jimmy Baldwin, and I think I'm speaking for a great many other Negroes too. It doesn't matter any longer what you do to me. You can put me in jail, you can kill me. But by the time I was 17, you've done everything that you could do to me. The problem now is, how are you going to save yourselves? It was a great shock to me. The Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, did not know that I would have trouble convincing my nephew to go to Cuba, for example, to liberate the Cubans in defense of a government which now says is doing everything it can, which cannot liberate me. Now there are 20 million people in this country, and you can't put them all in jail. And I know how my nephew feels. I know how I feel. I know how the cats in the barbershop feel. A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. We're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or, some abstraction called the Negro problem. These Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here, on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
But there is this picture of young Negro college students. Could you react to the student nonviolent movement, which has made such an impact, which has affected both Negroes and whites?
Well, of course, one of the things I think that happened, really, is that in the first place, the Negro has never been as docile as white Americans wanted to believe. That was a myth. We were not singing and dancing down the levee. We were trying to keep alive. We were trying to survive a very brutal system. The Negro has never been happy in his place. What those kids, first of all, prove, they prove that. They come from a long line of fighters. And what they also prove is not that the Negro has changed, but that the country has arrived at a place where it can no longer contain the revolt, as it could do once. Let's say I was a Negro college president, and I needed a new chemistry lab. So I was a Negro leader, because the white man said I was. And I came to get a new chemistry lab. And the tax price I paid for the chemistry lab was to control the people I represented. And now, I can't do that. We were talking to Negro students after this. They've been through it all, who's half dead. That's an awful lot to ask a person to bear. The country sat back in admiration for those kids for 3 or 4 or 5 years and has not lifted a finger to help them. Now, we all knew, I know you knew and I knew too, that a moment was coming when we couldn't guarantee, then no one can guarantee that it won't reach the breaking point. You can only survive so many beatings, so much humiliation, so much despair, so many broken promises, before something gives. Human beings are not by nature nonviolent. Those children had to pay a terrible price in discipline, in moral discipline, an interior effort and courage which the country cannot imagine, because it still thinks Gary Cooper, for example, was a man.
You said cannot expect them to remain nonviolent?
No, you can't. You can't. And furthermore, there were always these students that we're talking about. When I was in Tallahassee, there were some students protesting, a minority. But there were many, 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 many more students who had given up, who were desperate, and whom Malcolm X can reach, for example, much more easily than I can. What Malcolm tells them, in effect, is that they should be proud of being black, and God knows that they should be. That's a very important thing to hear. Of course, in order to do this, what he does is destroy a truth and invent a history. What he does is say, you're better because you're black. Well, of course, that isn't true. That's the trouble. It is the only movement in the country which we can call grassroots. I hate to say that, but it's true. When Malcolm talks, or one of the Muslim ministers talk, they articulate, for all the Negro people who hear them, who listen to them, they articulate their suffering, the suffering which has been in this country so long denied. That's Malcolm's great authority over any of his audiences. He corroborates their reality.
This is more effective appeal than the appeal of Martin Luther King?
It's much more sinister because it is much more effective. It's much more effective because it is, after all, comparatively easy to invest a population with a false morale by giving a false sense of superiority. And it will always break down in a crisis. It's the history of Europe, simply. It's one of the reasons we're in this terrible place. It's one of the reasons we have 5 cops standing on a black woman's neck in Birmingham. Because at some point they were taught and they believed that they were better than other people because they were white. It leads to a moral bankruptcy. It is inevitable. It cannot but lead there. My point here is that the country is for the first time worried about the Muslim movement. It shouldn't be worried about the Muslim movement. That's not the problem. The problem is to eliminate the conditions which breed the Muslim movement.
Well, I'd like to come back to get some of your thoughts about the relationship between Martin Luther King's appeal, that is effectively nonviolent, and his philosophy of disciplined love for the oppressor. What is the relationship between this and the reality of the Negro masses?
Well, Martin's very rare, a very great man. Martin's rare for 2 reasons. Part because just because he is, and because he's a real Christian, and he really believes in nonviolence. He's arrived at something in himself. And he still has great moral authority in the South. There's none whatever in the North. Poor Martin has gone through God knows what kind of hell to awaken the American conscience. But Martin has reached the end of his rope. There's some things Martin can't do. Martin's only one man. Martin can't solve the nation's central problem by himself. There are lots of people, lots of black people I mean now, who don't go to church no more and don't listen to Martin, and who anyway are themselves produced by civilization, which has always glorified violence, unless the Negro had the gun. Martin is undercut by the performance of the country. The country is only concerned about nonviolence if it seems that I'm going to get violent. It's not worried about nonviolence if it's some Alabama sheriff.
What do you see as the future of our nation? Are you essentially optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I'm both glad and sorry you asked me that question. I'll do my best to answer it. I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm supposed to be an optimist. I'm supposed to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they've maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger. I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference between the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why. And the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.